So I'm absolutely delighted, something that she would probably not have considered at all when she was at school, that she would be coming up in a couple of seconds to give a keynote speech at a conference like this in New Zealand, and you'll hear that she's from Scotland. So she's an exemplar of new blood coming into science, coming into our organisation, doing incredibly well and being an example to others like her. So give a big hand, please, to Rachelle.
Tēnā koutou katoa. No Scotland ahau, kei Otautahi ahau e naha ana, ko Rachelle Binny tōku ingoa. And kia ora, Richard, for the introduction. Oh, I think I'm pushing the wrong button. Oh, there we go. So our theme so far this morning has been te aki, or protect. But now I'd like to shift gears slightly and start us thinking more about whakahau, or restoration. With all this talk about killing predators, I think it's important that we don't lose sight of our ultimate goal here, which is to restore New Zealand's indigenous ecosystems. So yesterday and this morning, we had a couple of questions around, do we actually know what impact our predator control in New Zealand is having for our indigenous ecosystems? And I've been wriggling and hopping up and down in my seat because that is exactly the question that I hope I can answer for us today. So how can we set the scene for a predator-free Aotearoa? How can we start to set realistic expectations for what biodiversity impacts we're going to have from the predator control that we're doing? So today, first of all, what I'd like to talk about is the theme of our symposium. How can we partner for impact? Among our communities and our eco-sanctuaries and our agencies, we have a wealth of knowledge and experience. So how can we really bring all this experience together to really stand us in the best possible stead towards achieving our ultimate goal of being predator-free? I'll talk a little bit about the different common predator control regimes that we have in New Zealand. And these range from suppression all the way through to eradication. So they have different targets in terms of what they're trying to achieve with their pest control. And finally, I want to think a little bit about how we can use our past and our current restoration to really help us come up with a strategy for where we're going with our future restoration. So here are four of our quite common predator control regimes in New Zealand. So first of all, up on the top left, we have ring-fenced sanctuaries. So these are sanctuaries like Zealandia here in Wellington, where the goal is really eradication. All pests except mice are eradicated from inside the sanctuary. And then a pest-resistant fence encircles the sanctuary and does a pretty good job of preventing reinvasion, but they do get the very odd invader coming in. Then down on your bottom left, we have fenced peninsulas. Again, here the goal is eradication. There's a pest-resistant fence at the neck of the peninsula, but in this case, we've got a slightly higher reinvasion risk. Pests can leak around the coastal edges of the peninsula fence. So staff inside these sanctuaries are constantly having to contend with reinvasion. Then up in the top right, we have unfenced mainland islands. So these are sites like our dock mainland islands, but also a huge number that are run by community groups and other agencies. And here the goal isn't to eradicate, but instead to suppress. And actually the number of pests that remain in these sites after sustained trapping and baiting can actually range quite widely, but we can actually learn quite a lot from this, as I'll come to later. And then finally, down in the bottom right, we have a fourth regime, large-scale possum-focused control. So this is the likes of Doc's Battle for Our Birds, and large-scale TB-free, run by Osprey type control. And again, the goal is to suppress but not eradicate. And we can almost split this into two regimes for aerial operations versus ground-based operations as well. So across our eco-sanctuaries in New Zealand is this huge wealth of knowledge. And as well as controlling predators and restoring ecosystems, these amazing sanctuaries are also monitoring everything. They're monitoring biodiversity, they're monitoring pests. So to try and start to answer these really big questions around what impact is our predator control having for biodiversity, we really needed to partner for impact. So this is our theme over these 2 days, and this work would not be possible without building a partnership across these sanctuaries. So we reached out to Sanctuaries of New Zealand and also to DOC's mainland islands, and we asked what has been measured where in our sanctuaries in Aotearoa, and how much of this data might be available to be shared for a big analysis of ecosystem restoration. And the response we got was absolutely overwhelming, so we ended up with this amazing database of biodiversity monitoring data from sites across the country, over 1 million records, 26 sites, a whole different range of different types of sanctuaries, spanning 25 years of monitoring, which is a huge testament to all the hard work of sanctuaries staff, and a whole different range of types of species as well. So it certainly at this point felt very ambitious and very crazy. So we have all 3 different types of eco-sanctuaries have contributed data for this big national analysis. And here we can see they're spread across both islands. And when we look at the pest monitoring data, just for one key pest target, so for ship rats, we can see this kind of confirms what we were looking at in terms of eradication versus suppression. So in our ring-fence sanctuaries, when we look at ship rats, eradication is pretty successful, and that means our rats track at about 0%. When we look at fenced peninsulas, we have the occasional reinvader to contend with, so occasionally we get a slight increase up to about 10% in our rodent tracking. And finally, unfenced mainland islands actually can have quite a huge variability in the number of ship rats that are inside the sanctuary, but this is actually something that can be very informative, as we'll see quite soon. So as well as using a whole variety of types of control methods, we also have a whole range of biodiversity monitoring methods that are used inside our sanctuaries. And with all these different types of information, we really needed a way of clearing a path through all this clutter and coming up with one single universal measure of biodiversity that we could use to compare across sites and over time and look at exactly how biodiversity was responding to pest control. And we did this using a technique called meta-analysis. I won't go into too much of the technical details around how meta-analysis works, other than to say it's becoming an increasingly common method used in the field of ecology, and it does allow you to come up with this big single measure of biodiversity outcome. Okay, so I'm a mathematician. I love graphs. I appreciate it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I'll take you through this one. So this is exactly what we did, is we pulled all this information together to try and come up with one universal biodiversity measure. And what this graph shows, I'll explain first, the bottom axis is control duration, so the number of years that we've been doing pest control inside a sanctuary. And I should say this is all of our eco-sanctuary data combined, first of all. And on this vertical axis, we have what's called an effect size, and this is our single measure of biodiversity. So if you can see the dashed line at 0, this indicates that the pest control we're doing is having no effect. Anything above that line is a biodiversity benefit, so a positive response to predator control. Anything below the line is a negative response, so that would be species declining as a result of us doing pest control. And just to give you a sense of the scale here, if we went up to about a value of 0.7, that would indicate that our populations had doubled on account of doing pest control. So that's quite a sizable increase. And then the points here are these effect sizes, these measures of biodiversity impact. And as we can see, if we look at our bird populations in this graph, we see an amazing increase in the biodiversity on account of doing pest control. The most rapid increase happens in about the first 5 years or so, but even 15, 16 years on, we're still seeing an increase. I should say the error bars indicate how much certainty we have in these estimates, so how confident we are in the estimate, and you can see for some points that's actually quite large. And finally, I've shaded these last few points in grey. The reason being, we only had a couple of very long-term studies available, so it's unlikely that this dip in biodiversity that we see actually reflects a true dip. It's just that we need more data, more of those long-term studies. And we did a similar thing for invertebrates and for vegetation. So you can see that on the whole, we get really great biodiversity responses for these two different taxonomic groups, but there weren't as many invertebrate studies or as much vegetation being monitored as for birds, so we do have quite large uncertainty around those measures. So then we wanted to ask, okay, this is all of our eco-sanctuary outcome combined, but could we tease apart the different regimes that we talked about, these different sanctuary types? And that's what we did next. So here, first of all, draw your attention to the red circles. So first of all, looking at the restoration trajectories for ring-fenced sanctuaries. And as you can see, we have amazing biodiversity benefits, particularly for our bird populations up at the top there. Peninsula fenced sanctuaries, where again we've eradicated, but we have the odd reinvader. We still see amazing increases, but to a slightly lesser degree. And lastly, our unfenced sites, where the goal is suppression, not eradication, we still see really great benefits, but slightly less so than our ring-fenced sanctuaries, which is what we would expect. And again, for invertebrates and for vegetation, we also see great increases, but you can start to see where we're missing certain types of information, particularly around peninsula fenced sanctuaries for these two groups. So now I want to think just a bit about our bird populations in more detail, and particularly about our endemic species. So these are New Zealand bird species that are found nowhere else in the world, only in New Zealand. And we can almost group species into depths of endemicity, so different levels of how endemic they are, based on how long they've been found in New Zealand. So if we go to the very middle of this circle here, to our very deepest endemic species, our most iconic species that are found nowhere else in the world, these are our kiwi species. They've been around for a really, really long time. As you go out towards the edge of this circle, we have more recent endemic species that aren't found anywhere else in the world, but they might have some genetically similar cousins, maybe elsewhere, perhaps Australia. And these are species like our honey-eaters, our komako, and our tui. And then actually you can go outside the circle as well and look at species that aren't endemic, but they are native to New Zealand, but are also found elsewhere in the world. And also our introduced species like our blackbirds too. So we wanted to ask, do these different endemic groups, how do they respond to predator control? Do they respond any better than these recent natives? And it turns out that the data shows quite clearly that they do. So I'll draw your attention first to this red line, which shows our trajectory for our very deep endemics. So species like our hihi are showing the greatest, most positive response to predator control. And they're also showing the fastest response there too. Then if we go to the bottom two lines, this blue and purple line, these are our recent natives and our introduced species, which actually don't do so well, and they actually lie below the dashed line, so they actually decline on account of doing pest control. And then our more recent endemics, so species like our honey-eaters, they still have an amazing benefits, but to a slightly lesser degree than our very deep endemic hihi and kiwi. So I think it's amazing that the data shows us that so clearly, and that we've got these trajectories going up to over 15 years. Now I just want to look at one snapshot in time, 7 years since we started control, and start to have a think about, given that we have all our eco-sanctuary data in here, can we start to think about what effect the differences in how many pests are left at these sites, what impact that might have for the biodiversity there. And that's what I've done here. So what these graphs are showing is how sensitive different endemic groups are to any pests that remain. Now I've just gone with one key pest, ship rats, so I've switched out our bottom axis here for the number of ship rats that are left in a sanctuary, or ship rat tracking rate. And again, we have this measure of biodiversity on the vertical axis. And the steepness of the slope of these lines indicates just how vulnerable a group of species are to any ship rats that are remaining. And if we look first of all at the red line, we have a really steep downward curve, which is telling us that these really deep endemics are the most sensitive species to even small increases in ship rats that remain in a sanctuary. If you look across to the other side, to our introduced species, we've got a slightly flatter slope there, which is kind of saying these species are fairly insensitive to any changes in pests that remain. And then in the middle, we have our more recent endemics, which are sensitive, but to a slightly lesser degree than species like our hihi. And what's really important about being able to draw these kind of results is that you can start to come up with quite clear thresholds for what pest abundance you need to achieve in order to deliver a good and desired outcome for your biodiversity. So we can start to say this is the level of ship rats that we need to get down to see the outcome that we want to see inside our sanctuary. And finally, we don't just care about birds, we want to care about bugs as well. Here I'm again looking across all our different types of eco-sanctuaries, and I'm not thinking about how endemic different invertebrates are, but just looking at different orders of invertebrates, and I'm not looking over time, so I've kind of switched the graph here. So our effect size on the bottom, everything to the right of the dashed line is now our positive benefit to biodiversity, and everything to the left is a negative response to biodiversity, to predator control. And I've just highlighted in red 3 of our kind of iconic large-bodied invertebrates. So down in the bottom, we can see that we get really great benefits from predator control to weta, and also to some of our native snail species, things like Poelephanta, do really well. But others don't do so well, and we're not exactly sure why that is yet, but we do have some ideas. And these are things like our native beetles. And finally, I promised I'd come back to thinking about this large-scale possum focus control and how that compares to the types of control we see inside our sanctuaries. And that's exactly what we've done here. Again, our graphs are flipped, so everything to the right of the line is a biodiversity benefit, and everything to the left is saying biodiversity is declining. And we can see that our possum focus control does give benefits to biodiversity as well, but to a slightly lesser degree than we would have in sanctuaries, which is what we would expect. If you look at invertebrates and veg, it looks like the ground-based operations might be giving slightly better benefits compared to the aerial control, but on the whole, things are looking really good from all 4 of these regimes. So to just try and wrap all this up, what are some of the key take-home messages from this big analysis? Well, this has been the first synthesis of biodiversity outcomes across 4 of New Zealand's predator control regimes, 5 if we think of this possum focus regime as being aerial control and ground-based operations. And we've seen that predator control is benefiting biodiversity, so I hope we've started to tick that and answer that question. We do better when we can eradicate versus suppress predators. So the more predators we can remove, the better the benefits are. And also, the longer we can sustain control, the better the benefits they are too. And we've seen that responses vary among different taxonomic groups, among our birds and our invertebrates and our vegetation. And we've seen that of these, our deep endemics seem to be showing the strongest responses overall. We've also seen that the variability that we get in the number of pests that remain in these sites can be very informative because it can help us to start to make very clear predictions about where our pest abundance thresholds are to be able to deliver good outcomes for biodiversity. And I think we knew little bits about this for some particular species, but it's amazing to be able to start to show this at a national scale and quite clearly. And finally, we started to get a better idea of what our ecosystem trajectories look like for birds and for vertebrates and for vegetation. And we've started to get a better feel for how full eradication compares to large-scale suppression. So what I hope these findings start to highlight is that large-scale suppression could be a really important and useful stepping stone towards the ultimate goal of eradication further down the track. As I think Bruce said earlier in the panel, we don't currently have the tool for complete eradication across the whole mainland currently. But what about if we think of large-scale control as a stepping stone towards that and a means of holding the line on pests while we start to come up with a more concrete strategy for how and where we should hold the line versus remove and defend towards our ultimate goal of full eradication. And finally, I want to finish by coming back to partnering for impact. This work just would not have been possible without the partnerships among these sanctuaries and other agencies. And the very meticulous biodiversity monitoring that these sites do, I think just deserves a huge round of applause and should be a key part of our restoration future. But there are still knowledge gaps that are remaining, so I would definitely call for future long-term and very consistent monitoring to be supported, but also for us to come up with a strategy for how to really capitalise on that monitoring to really set us up well towards our ultimate goal of eradicating pests. And with that, I just want to really acknowledge and give a heartfelt thanks to our partners, particularly those in DOC, Craig Gillies, who was instrumental in pulling together all the DOC mainland island data, Robbie Price, who helped us with the infrastructure for our big database, and all the staff and volunteers from our sanctuaries across New Zealand. Over 23 sanctuaries contributed data for this analysis. And last but not least, absolute heartfelt thanks to my amazing colleagues and mentors at Manaaki Whenua, so Andrea Byrom, John Innes, Roger Peck, Neil Fitzgerald, and Alex James from the University of Canterbury. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rachelle, and you did want a big round of applause as well for all of the sanctuaries, right?
For the sanctuaries.
Huge, huge one. So I've seen on the app that we do have quite a few questions for you already, and just a few minutes to answer them. So the first one is from Bets. How do we prioritise the location of eco-sanctuaries?
Is this on? Yep. That's an excellent question. So I think really we want to have as many sanctuaries in as many kind of diverse ecosystems as possible. So we have a lot of sanctuaries, particularly around the North Island, but it would be great to see even more on the South Island. We have things like Orokonui and a new one, Brook Waimadama, in terms of fenced sanctuaries, and a whole number of unfenced sites too. But it would be good to see a bigger spread in different types of habitat for sanctuaries. A lot of our sanctuaries are podocarp broadleaf forest sanctuaries or coastal. We don't have very many beach forest sanctuaries, for example. So it would be nice to see more of those pop up. And I think having these different types of sanctuaries and different tools allows us to really restore more diverse biota and different types of communities, yeah.
And our next question, Landcare Research has amassed and analysed a huge amount of data on predator control outcomes. Is this data analysis easy to access, or is there open access?
That's a good question. So this has been a huge partnership, and data management and data ownership is not an easy problem to solve. Actually, even just pulling all this data together and finding out who had measured what and where was quite a challenge. And because this is a partnership, there's a lot of trust. So I think if for this data to be open access, it would be a matter of going back and having that discussion with the sanctuaries and the people who've collected and shared this data for this work. But I suspect a lot would be happy for this data to be used to answer different questions, but we would have to have that discussion, yeah.
And unfortunately, this has to be our last question, because at least they're high quality, even though we have a small amount of time. You state that the more predators we remove, the better the response. Does it matter what combinations or order we remove pests in? For instance, removing just possums and rats versus just possums.
That's a really good question, and I don't have the simple answer to that, but I think there's a lot of great minds in this room that could start to pick apart that problem. I think we understand some of this. What's interesting is that when we go to eradication and take out a lot of pests, we don't eradicate mice inside sanctuaries, so there will be impacts from those pests. And maybe that's something that if we were eradicating large scale in the mainland, we would have to be contending with as well. So that in terms of possums, rats, that's not something we've teased apart yet, but the data is there now so that we can start to answer these tricky questions.
With 8 seconds to spare. I did notice as well that you put your email on your last slide, so obviously with all of these questions, could we ask that people can get in touch with you direct, Kate Paitena? That's
absolutely,
okay?
Yeah, and in the coffee breaks too.
And also, give us your social media. No, that's all good. Thank you so much. Please put your hands together for Rachelle. Kia ora.